Roman Culture by Alana Burns, Caleb Burns, Brenna Hoover, and Zachary Vanderploeg. Next slide. Rome's background. Rome's history can be traced all the way back to 753 BC, making it one of the oldest cities in Europe. It has many unique culture elements, such as hosting the leader of Christianity, also known as the Pope. It is currently home to 3.7 million people. First off, fashion in Rome. Next slide. Fashion in Rome. Next slide. Fashion for men. In early Roman times, an average everyday man would wear a tunic. If a man was wealthy, he could afford what is known as a toga. The more money a man had, the more stylish-looking toga a man wore. Shoes that a man wore also was a big determining factor in one's social status. Next slide. On the left, you can see an average tunic. In the middle, you can see a normal-looking toga. And on the right, you can see a stylish toga that very wealthy men would wear. Next slide. Women's fashion. Women of early Roman times only wore one type of outfit called a stola, which had a cloak or pallium wrapped around it. It was an unwritten rule back in the day that women were not allowed to wear hats, but were still required to have their heads covered up. Usually, the cloak or the pallium that they wore wrapped around the stola had a head spot that would easily cover their head. Next slide. On the left, you can see a woman wearing a stola with a pallium wrapped around her, and on the right, you can see a woman also wearing a stola, but instead of having a pallium, she has a cloak wrapped around her. Next slide. Children's fashion. Little girls often wore a regular tunic, but the tunic had a belt to go along with the outfit. Girls also had to put on a different tunic that was more baggy and was long for the size whenever they were out playing or doing outside activities. Boys also wore a tunic. The only difference between a boy's tunic and a man's tunic was that the boys had a crimson border around the edges of it. Boys wore this until they were somewhere between 16 to 17 years of age. After that, they were considered a man and given an all-white tunic. Next slide. On the left, you can see young girls wearing a tunic with a belt wrapped around it, and on the right, children wearing baggy clothes because they are playing outside. Next slide. Cloth. Wool was the most commonly used cloth due to its toughness and durability. The clothes they are made out of are hard to tear and rip. The other two cloths that were used was cotton and silk. Only rich families could afford these two cloths due to the high price of having them imported from China and from India. Indigo was the dye most commonly used to color the ancient clothes. Next slide. On the top left, you can see wool. That was the most commonly used. On the bottom left was silk, usually used for togas, cotton on the top right, and on the bottom right, indigo, the dye that was most commonly used to color the clothes. Next slide. Accessories. There are lots of accessories that men, women, and children used. First off, for men. Whenever they had a bald spot, they used a wig to cover up that spot. Younger men would grow beards as soon as they could because that's simply what was in back then. But back then, men were the ones that wore the rings for their looks, not women. They either wore it on their fingers or on their toes. They wore anywhere from 1 up to 16 rings on their fingers and on their toes. Next slide. The two pictures on the left you can see are some of the rings that they wore, along with the picture in the very middle. And the two pictures on the very right were just some of the many types of wigs that they would have worn back then. Next slide. Accessories continued. Women needed to look pretty, and most people believe that makeup came from early Rome. Women used chalk powder and charcoal as a form of makeup to make themselves look better. Women also use extensions to make their hair look better and have a better look to themselves. Women who had more money in their families actually used the hair of slaves as extensions of their own. Next slide. On the very left, you can see an example of an extension of slave hair that rich women would have worn. And on the right, you can see chalk powder and charcoal. Those were the two that were used as makeup to make the woman look prettier. Next slide. Now, a bula. When boys and girls are born, they are given a locket that is called a bula. They are supposed to hold on to it until, if you are a woman, marriage, and if you are a boy, until you become a true man. After that, you are supposed to hold on to it to pass it on to future generations of the family. Next slide. You can see these are some examples of bulas that were used that they carried around as they were younger and passed on through generations.
When visiting Rome, you may see some of the fashions that Zach has mentioned in the many churches that Rome has. They have hundreds of churches and they make up most of their city. Some of the religions that are in Rome include Catholicism, Judaism, Baptist, Methodist, Presbyterian, and many more. Although the official religion of Rome is Christianity, specifically Catholicism. First, let's talk about a few of the less common religions and churches in Rome. There's only one church in Rome for Judaism. It was constructed in 1904, but was not completely accepted by Romans until Pope John Paul II visited in 1986. He prayed at the synagogue with the rabbi, which was unheard of for a pope to do. The next somewhat rare religion found in Roman culture is Islam. There is also only one mosque in Rome, which was built in 1944. There was much debate on building this mosque in Rome when, again, Pope John Paul II gave his blessing on the construction. It is not clear when the first Catholic church was erected, but Catholicism became so present in Rome that it became the official religion in 380 AD. Now Rome houses over 600 Catholic churches. Catholicism has now expanded from Rome to other countries with over 1.28 billion members around the world. Even though these Catholic churches are found in other cities and countries, they are still referred to as Roman Catholic churches. There are four main Christian, specifically Catholic, churches in Rome, known as the major basilicas. These include St. Mary Major, St. John Lateran, St. Paul outside the walls, and St. Peter's in the Vatican. The largest church in Rome is the Basilica di Santa Maria Maggiore, otherwise known as St. Mary Major. It is one of the oldest churches in Rome, being built in 440 AD. On August 5th of every year, in celebration of Basilica's Miracle of the Snows, thousands of white petals fall from the ceiling inside the church. The church also features 36 scenes from the Old Testament on the walls above the altar, shown here. St. Mary Major has never been remodeled, so it is one of the best showcases of Rome's basilicas. The official cathedral of Rome is called St. John Lateran. It was built in the 14th century AD, making it one of the oldest Christian churches in Rome. Not much is left of the original church, although, due to various problems such as vandalism and natural disasters. Although the church does hold a baptistry built in AD 315 by Emperor Constantine. The third major basilica in Rome is St. Paul outside the walls. It is said that this basilica was founded over the burial place of St. Paul. Later, in 386 AD, Emperor Theodosius I built a larger basilica in its place. This structure has undergone major changes like that until 604 AD, when the pavement was raised so that the altar would be directly on top of St. Paul's tomb. Unfortunately, in 1823, a fire was started which nearly destroyed the entire building, ruining what had been preserved for over 1,000 years. While some people believe the Vatican City is part of Rome, it is actually a separate city surrounded on all sides by Rome. Although Rome's culture certainly influenced the church there. The Catholic Church started in Rome, and now the Pope's Church is housed in Vatican City, as well as the Pope himself. The Vatican City does, however, have catacombs under the St. Basilica Church that was the burial grounds for Romans, called the Vatican Necropolis. Roman law forbade Romans to bury their dead within the walls of Rome, which is why they are in what is now Vatican City. Visitors can now currently take tours of the excavated catacombs. While again this church is not technically in Rome, Roman culture and Catholicism grew into the Vatican City, where St. Peter's Basilica, arguably the most important Catholic church, was built. This is the fourth and final church of Rome's 4 basilicas. It took architects 120 years to build the church, and it covers a vast 5.7 acres and can hold up to 60,000 people. Some of the most culturally impressive works in the building are by artist Michelangelo, who painted the Sistine Chapel, or the dome in the St. Basilica, and also he has a sculpture feature there called the Pieta, which shows the Virgin Mary holding a crucified Jesus in her arms. While the Pantheon was originally a pagan structure, it has since been converted into a Catholic church. It is also known by the name Basilica of St. Mary and the Martyrs, and it now even offers church to people on Sundays, despite starting as a pagan building. It was originally built in 27 BCE, but wasn't converted to Catholicism until the 17th century. This is one of many buildings tourists visit to see the amazing architecture and culture in Rome. What are some other architectural great things, Caleb?
The architecture of Rome is one of the most iconic things when talking about Rome, whether that be the amazing Colosseum or temple that has long stood the test of time. Going into the history of Roman architecture, we'll learn some few things in the next slide. In the history of Roman architecture, the Romans took a lot of inspiration from the Greeks, whether that be the design of their pillars or techniques and methods that they had adopted from them. The Romans are responsible for such amazing structures as aqueducts, amphitheaters, triumphal arches, and bathhouses. The Romans would design cities in grid layouts along a single axis of one another to make it more organized and better look over the sea. Though the Greeks and others, such as the Persians and Egyptians, had made amazing structural feats, the Romans had made bigger and better structures because of the better techniques they used. Moving on to the next slide. Building techniques and methods. The Romans were the first to heavily use stucco in private homes. The Romans would use volcanic ash from Italy called tufa. Tufa was used to construct buildings because of its durability and its look of marble. Although it seems that marble was all over Rome, it didn't actually become very big until after Augustus' reign from 31 BCE to 14 CE. Concrete was made earlier in the 2nd century BCE. Because of the Romans' manufacture of concrete, architects could build much more creative and elaborate structures. Concrete was very strong and incredibly durable. It could even be set underwater, which is incredible. Even though mortar wasn't a new thing at the time, the Romans added volcanic sand. With the volcanic sand in place of normal sand, the mortar was much stronger and much more durable. Now, in the next slide, going into some of the amazing things the Romans are responsible for building. First being aqueducts. The Romans' aqueducts came in single, double, and triple arches. The aqueduct was used to carry water to cities, sometimes miles away. They carried water also to private homes, public baths, latrines, fountains, you name it. Aqueducts, you'd think, would have some sort of power source to deliver the water these miles away, but you'd actually be wrong. It was all gravity fed and along with downward slopes that held on in places. And most of the aqueducts were constructed underwater. It followed the terrain, and when it couldn't, they would tunnel through the obstructions. And now on the next slide, Roman bathhouses. The Roman bathhouses are famous in their own right. They have some spectacular and extravagant architecture. The bathhouses are typically these massive structures built symmetry along a single axis. The Romans were incredibly smart in the way they designed these. The bathhouses had cold and hot rooms, extravagant, stunning fountains, heated floors, and even heated walls that they would pipe through with piping systems behind the wall to actually heat it, which is amazing. The bathhouses consisted of three main parts. One being the temple, sacred springs, four main parts, sorry. The temple, sacred springs, Roman baths, and museum. Moving on to the next slide, amphitheaters. The Romans are most famous for their preferred method of building amphitheaters were enclosed ones, but could build them open to the elements, but they prefer the enclosed design. An amphitheater was designed with underground rooms for slaves, fighters, animals, and shows, other than blood sport. But one of the most famous games played in the amphitheaters were gladiatorial fights, blood sports. But those aren't the only events played there. There was also executions and animal fights. The amphitheaters consisted of four main parts: the arena, the vomitorium, and the cavea. The cavea was for different social classes to sit and watch the games. So you'd have upper, middle, and lower classes with different tiers where they'd sit. The arena was for fighting, obviously. The vomitorium were entrances at the arena and cavea levels so people could come and go quickly. Moving on to the next slide, one of the most famous amphitheaters, you might know it, the Colosseum. The Colosseum its design itself was widely copied throughout the Roman Empire. The Colosseum was commissioned to be built around 70-72 AD by Emperor Vespasian as a gift to the Roman people. The Colosseum was officially opened by Vespasian's son, Titus. The Colosseum's official name was Flavan Amphitheater, followed by 100 days of games and celebrations, including animal fights and gladiatorial fights. After 4 centuries of active use, the Great Colosseum was left unrepaired and broken. The Colosseum was used to salvage building materials for up until the 18th century. Two-thirds of the once magnificent Colosseum is gone now, destroyed by time in such parts. Now most of the Colosseum is gone. It's still an incredibly popular tourist destination and still a marvelous example of the Romans' ability to make amazing things. Moving on to the next slide, triumphal arches. Triumphal arches, like aqueducts, came in single, double, and triple layers. The triumphal arches didn't have any actual particular purpose other than to look decorative and beautiful, and the Romans were very good at this. The triumphal arch only real purpose was for inscriptions, normally having some sort of military significance. Moving on to the next slide, the Arch of Constantine is one of the largest surviving examples of a monument to Imperial Rome, and the structure is massive. It stands at 84 feet wide, 68 feet tall, and 24 feet deep. The Arch of Constantine is one of the largest Roman triumphal arches. It was built around 315 AD. The arch was commissioned by commemorated to Constantine's victory of the Maximinus in the Battle of the Milvian Bridge in 312 AD. On both sides of the Arch of Constantine is an inscription on what is called the Attic. The inscriptions were very common on triumphal arches at the time, and the particular one on the Arch of Constantine is in Latin, and it reads, "To the Emperor Flavius Constantine, the great, pious, and fortunate, the Senate of the people of Rome, because his divine inspiration and his own greatness of spirit with his armies. On both the tyrant and all of his faction, at once in rightful battle, he avenged in the state of dedication this arch as a mark of triumph." Moving on to the next slide. Last but not least are Roman temples. The temples were incredibly expensive and elaborate and beautiful in their own right because of the significance they had on Roman culture. The temples of Rome still to this day are one of the perfect examples of Roman architecture. You see it all the time when looking up things about Rome. It's one of the first things that come up. Roman temples were a combination of Greek and Tuscan models, and they had inner cellas in the rear of the building with columns surrounding the structure. Roman temples were normally rectangular, but they came in other forms such as polygonal and circular. Now that I have a base knowledge of Roman architecture, I'm going to now turn it over to Brenna with foods of Rome and festivals celebrating them. Thank you.
My part of the Roman Culture Project is talking about Roman food and food festivals. Food is an integral part in the culture of Rome. So first I will talk about Roman food, and then second I'll talk about restaurant etiquette, and then next I'll talk about the food festivals they have in Rome. So Rome has many dishes full of zest and Roman tradition to help keep the culture thriving. So Romans generally only eat fresh foods. This includes fresh meat, vegetables, and bread. They have tons of local bakeries and meat markets and fruit and vegetable markets everywhere all the time. So Rome is also very famous for their Italian food, which is pizza, pasta, soup, risotto, bread, cheese, coffee, etc. So generally in Rome, meals start with an antipasta, which is usually a fresh bread, then a primo, which is a pasta or soup, and then the next course is usually a meat or a fish with a side like a potato or a salad or prepared vegetables. And then there's usually a sweet course, which is cake, fruit, or gelato. And Romans always have coffee after the meal, which is kind of strange for me, because apparently coffee helps digest your food, and they only drink it after they eat their meals. So Rome has a lot of options for special dietary needs with vegetarian dining and available gluten-free foods. So now that I discussed Roman food, I'll talk about the etiquette used in Roman restaurants. Roman etiquette is very different from the American culture, and it's important to understand if you ever plan on going to Rome. So smoking is prohibited. Actually, smoking is banned in all public places in Italy, which is kind of different from here. Many restaurants have outdoor seating or some sort of cigarette break that you can use in between your courses. So before you go to a restaurant, be sure to confirm that smoking is permitted before you sit down and start eating. Tipping etiquette in Rome is very different from America also. The wages for waiters and waitresses in Rome is generally very high, so a low tip is expected. Generally, Romans tip only a few coins or round up to the next 5 or 10 on the bill. So most restaurants actually apply a service charge on the bill anyway, so there's no need to even tip at times. So now just for some basic restaurant go-tos if you're ever planning on going to Rome. You don't ever want to ask for Parmesan cheese. Apparently it's weird and sneered at by the waiters and waitresses. And that's very opposite to what Americans would think, because whenever we have pasta in America, we throw on the Parmesan cheese like on our spaghetti and stuff. You never want to order coffee before or during a meal or after noon. It's meant to help digest your food or wake you up in the morning. So for breakfast, you can have like coffee and a little piece of bread or something. But like if you're having dinner, don't ever have coffee before the meal. Always have it after to help digest your food. In Rome, bread always comes before your meal, but don't eat it until you get your main meal. It's supposed to be dipped in the leftover sauces from the meat of the pasta, which is also very different from us, because if we go to a Rome restaurant, we usually get our bread and we usually dip it in like oil and some seasoning, and we always scarf that down before our meal actually gets there, which is kind of sneered at in Rome. So now that we've learned about the etiquette in Rome, I will discuss the different food festivals that Rome has. Rome has actually several festivals for specific foods. The first one I'll talk about is Sagra del Cifaro. I think that's how you say it. This festival celebrates the artichoke, which is a staple in Roman cooking. This is a springtime festival beginning in May, and it highlights the many ways the artichoke can be cooked. During this festival, restaurants lower their prices on artichoke dishes, which is pretty cool, so you can get some cheap yummy artichoke dishes. The next festival is Festa di San Giuseppe. This is usually held on March 19th. The festival is actually a feast of St. Joseph, which used to be a national holiday in Rome, but it's not a public holiday anymore because of religious reasons, but is still celebrated. Romans eat deep-fried batter balls called Bing di San Giuseppe. I don't know, that doesn't sound good to me, but maybe it sounds good to them. They celebrate their Holy Week and Easter there, just like everyone else does everywhere. So the March-April time is when they celebrate it. On Good Friday, they have nonstop services and masses, which is pretty normal. And then on Easter Monday, Romans usually feast on specialties, such as cheesy bread with salami and hard-boiled eggs. I don't know, that sounds weird. And they also eat broad beans with cheese. So, first I talked about Roman food that they usually eat there, and the restaurant etiquette, and then I talked about the different food festivals that they have there. So next time you're in Rome, remember your special etiquette, and just remember your special etiquette. Also, it's kind of weird, Rome doesn't offer breakfast at their hotels like Americans do, so if you ever go there, just remember, bring your own breakfast food, or go without breakfast, I guess. I don't know. Alright, well, thank you.